Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, doing a solo bonus episode this week. Now, typically on the show, we have a topic related to behavior analysis. We discuss some relevant research articles in depth and then come up with some general strategies for practitioners. But sometimes, because, at the end of the day, point of this podcast for us was always to share research and have fun talking about it, we come upon a topic that might not fit that model, and we do one of these bonus episodes. Sometimes they're live events, sometimes they're just sort of discussions. And this is one kind of in that latter category where, just like Skinner says, if you find something interesting, drop everything and learn about it. Well, I was recently doing some, recovery in bed. I was a little under the weather, and I was reading a book that my mother had gotten me for Christmas called It's All a Game by Donovan. And there was a chapter in the book all about this history of board games, where Mr. Donovan was discussing an interview he had with a gentleman who ran a game store and ran after-school programs in which the games chosen were meant to sort of model and follow developmental levels. And he was noticing lots of different patterns in terms of what games different children were good at, how they learned certain strategies related to games, maybe say executive functioning or planning skills, and how even some, children with learning disabilities or with kind of, neurodiverse groups were starting to, see benefits from playing some of those games. And I immediately thought, that sounds super awesome. It sounds very in line with our goal here to increase knowledge about all sorts of learning, as well as to build bridges with other individuals. And even better, the individual who ran this store had been, before opening the store, a clinical psychologist and had worked in neuroscience research. So it seemed very much in line with some of the guests that we have on the show. And I reached out and was very, very happy to get a positive response from this gentleman, Dr. Jonathan Freeman, who was interested in coming on the show and talking about these after-school programs in which board games were sort of the method of the learning. And since I'm a huge fan of the board games, those of you who watch our videos often see we have a ton of board games in the house. Diana likes board games. Jackie, if it's someone's birthday, she'll play board games. So I thought, what a great idea for a topic to discuss. And since it wasn't necessarily directly related to research, thought, what a great bonus, something a little extra. So hopefully all of you who are interested in a little bit more research on the subject will forgive that while we discuss a lot of topics that have been researched and the idea of research and hypothesis testing, we're going a little bit beyond just behavior analysis. We're getting into a little neuroscience talk, which, again, nothing we should be scared of. We want to build bridges as a field, right? Even though we know it's not observable. And some of you hopefully say, I like board games too. I'd love to hear a little bit how they could be used for learning outside of just, the couple times we've talked about learning in board games. So with that out of the way, I hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. John Freeman from the Brooklyn Strategist about his after-school board game programs. Here it is. All right, so I am joined by Dr. John Freeman, who is not just a doctor, but also the owner of the Brooklyn Strategist board game store. Is that sort of the genre of store or gaming store?
I think they're called board game cafes. And,
okay.
and in full disclosure, I'm also an owner at Manhattan's Hexen Company.
Oh, I saw that as a place online, but I wasn't quite sure if that was just like a extension store or different type of store.
It's in many ways the same store, but just more of it.
Well, that's always good to know, especially after the year retail's had.
Yeah.
So John, I heard about you and your store and your after-school programs. I was reading a book called It's Only a Game, I believe is the title of the book. I may be misremembering. And I got to the chapter where they were the author was discussing board games and how board games can be used as learning tools. And you had a section in that chapter where you talked about your after-school programs. And I thought, what a great match for our show, where we talk about human behavior, but also a lot about learning and lots of ways learning can come in, and even some research related to teaching board game skills. So I thought it would be so awesome to get a chance to hear about your journey and to hear a little bit more about the programs that you have developed over the past years. Let's start with sort of your background, because I don't believe you can get a doctorate in board games at this point. So you must have gotten that from somewhere else.
Yeah, that's true. Although in fairness, there are some people who do play board games who should have honorary doctorates because they're just that smart. My background is I am a licensed clinical psychologist, and my background was largely in neuroscience. So, I don't know, for approximately, and specifically in sleep medicine. So, for approximately 25 years, I worked in sleep medicine post graduating college. Took interest in sort of brain analysis and brain imagery. Uh, maintained a private clinical practice, but also was directing a neuroscience research center, which focused largely on clinical trials of different CNS or central nervous system compounds. And that, at some level, was truly gratifying work. The problem is, after leaving academia, because I had no great love for academia, and then sort of joining the corporate world, I discovered I had even less of an appetite for the corporate world. And so thought to myself, my misery index was pretty high, even though I was doing a lot of stuff that I really loved and felt positively about. And my wife said to me, you should just quit. Like, what am I going to do? I've just spent pretty much my whole life working towards these goals, and if I walk away from the field now, it's going to be pretty hard to get back into it. So I cogitated on that for some time, and sort of one day had this epiphany that at the time my 7-year-old daughter had practically nothing to do after school. I sort of was thinking to myself, there's got to be more. There was nothing in our sort of burgeoning kid-centered neighborhood, other than the 2 programs that had been around forever, and those were at capacity. And I thought, could something? Is there a space for more? And then I thought, well, what the hell would I do in this area? And then I said, well, I recognize when my kid and I play board games together. She is active, engaged, fun. There's a great dynamic that exists between us. Could I develop a program around playing board games for after school? Would there be interest in that? And so I thought about that some more, and I started doing some research into it, and really sort of discovered, other than what you might find in your local school clubs, which were usually very specific. When I grew up, you had chess and Go, and that was kind of it. And maybe later when I got into high school, some D&D, but that was like, you couldn't attract too many friends doing that back in the day. Today it's the new sexy and
I know,
and suave, but back when I did it, no. Maybe I'm aging myself a little bit by that, but anyway, the upshot was, I thought, okay, maybe let's give it a try. And in full disclosure, I had a very supportive wife who could support us both if I fell out of my former profession. So I felt like I had a pretty big cushion to land on if I tried it and all else failed. Right. So that was a great comfort. And so, I took my best research assistant at the time from the existing business that I was in, who was also kind of miserable, but was pretty damn good. And I found somebody who was, could help me develop some food concepts around a sort of larger idea of the board game cafe, which didn't really exist at the time. They were going back to 2009, 2010. This, what seems more commonplace today didn't really exist.
It was kind of, sounds like it was early in the sort of like real early in terms of like the board game renaissance. I feel like we've been having the past 5-6 years here in America.
I will pat myself on the back just a little bit for helping contribute to some of that. Because the interesting thing is, when I got into this field and decided to go for it, the field was in massive contraction. It had gone from something like 1,200 game stores just in the United States to a little over 700 or something like that. And I was on the phone with, game store owners from around the country, and they were all sort of, first cautioning me about even getting into the field, telling me their little bits, and they kept asking me, well, what are you going to do that's different? How are you going to survive in the New York market? And I wasn't telling them because I did not want to let the cat out of the bag.
Keep those trade secrets close.
I have a new mousetrap here. I'm going to try that. The funny thing is, so the first class was my daughter and a bunch of her friends. And man, oh man, did that first class go really swimmingly. And here comes my dog. Okay. Sorry. And he just pushed his way in. Anyway, then, and then the next day when I wasn't going to make my daughter come to every class and bring her friends every class, we sat there twiddling our thumbs, wondering, I wonder if anyone else is going to come in the store. And lo and behold, we sort of did some troubleshooting and planning and figured out how to get people in our door. And the really interesting thing is once we got customers in our door, they kept coming. And that was the really cool thing. Now, about the ontogenesis of the program, if there's sort of one thing, you probably don't know about me is I'm one of these people who likes to dive deep. So if I'm going to commit myself to something, I do the research, and I'm pretty good at doing research, and really try to examine.
You were a director of, so yeah,
yeah, and it's something I enjoy doing. In the same way I enjoy doing, solving crossword puzzles. It's gamification of life, right? So
yeah.
So what I did prior to even starting that first class with my kid was, I said, okay, well, what's going to differentiate this program from any other program that's out there that plays games after school? What makes this appealing as something new and different? And so I took a deep dive and recognized that a lot of the games that get played, all games that get played have a variety of what we would call mechanics, which is anything from the actions you take, the number of actions you take, to what we would call top-down processes, right? How you evaluate what's in front of you, and if it's a dynamic, ever-changing landscape of a board, can you sort of roll with it and make adjustments on the fly? Well, it sort of clicked for me. I guess my second epiphany in all of this was that a lot of the games that I was learning, and mind you, I'm an old school gamer. I played all the classic abstracts growing up. There wasn't much beyond what we would call Ameritrash games. In my household and my friends' households growing up, with a couple exceptions. I did get into the Avalon Hill games and Stratimatic. I was an early player of that particular game.
Those I never played those. I think those are came a little before my time, but I've read about them in books. They seem like the ultimate math game, really.
that sort of relegates me to the age of the dinosaur, anyway. And it's still an ongoing argument and joke I have with my staff. But I recognize that a lot of these games that we're playing emulate mechanics and processes that you might see in neuropsychological evaluations. And part of my background was I did a lot of neuropsychological assessment. And so I said, I wonder if there could be a connection between some of the games we play and focal brain area. And then I sought out to create a curriculum around games that focused in specific brain areas. And then could we go within focal brain area, could we go sequentially from simplest through most complex? So there were a few axes here, right? The first axis is, does it align in the brain? And then the second one is, how do you go from simplest to complex within a focal area? Does that mean including more focal areas? Does that include different orders of operation, et cetera, et cetera? So I sat down to do the task, and my first iteration of it was what I would say was something. I wouldn't call it great by any standards, but it was something. And I thought, well, wouldn't this be cool? Parents can sign their kids up for development in focal brain areas. And some parents were actually interested in this idea. The problem is the kids weren't. What would happen is the kids would start out, and let's say we're playing word games, right? And the kids would start out having a lot of fun with word games, and we have a certain method that we established for, how to teach the games and viewing games as novel problems to be solved, whether it's word or Eurostyle or you name it. And and by week 4 or 5, the kids were like, "Oh, word games again." And if there was a table next to us that was playing something different, whatever was going on at the table next to them was the much more interesting game. And, at that point, my staff, which had grown a little bit, had said to me, maybe we should rethink how we're doing this because the kids are really struggling. And I said, yeah, you're right. And so we went to what we now call our spiral curriculum. And the spiral curriculum is basically, we will now, for each class, cover a different focal area with each game that we play. So that we'll be covering as much of the brain as we can cover in one session or, one trimester's worth of games. And then for the second trimester, we'll get a little deeper and go to the next level and still do all the same focal brain areas. Okay. So that's how we made a fairly major change in the curriculum.
Right. So John, with your background in neuroscience as well as clinical psychology, most of our audience, while we understand that the brain is there, it does things. You can scan it. It has a function in our bodies. We're usually focused more on what can we see with our own eyes. So when you're talking about like focal areas and in terms of sort of what the different games would target, could you give examples of sort of what you might see? So like, what's kind of the observable, whether directly known or hypothesized behavior that comes from those kind of the focal areas in the brain?
Sure, it really depends on specifically what focal area, but I can say generally. First, it's a really insightful question. Because this is precisely the biggest problem we have. So I'll give you an example. Many of the games we play look at something what's called in the assessment world for intelligence is called processing speed, and it's simply how quickly can you take information that's in front of you on a table, bring it into your brain, and then respond to it. And so a lot of great games like this are reaction time games. In neuropsychological testing, they're not particularly fun, and I wouldn't say they are games. But in the case of games that really closely emulate what some of the neuropsychological tests are, you would expect to see faster processing times, as a result of practicing the skill over and over again. Or if we're looking into games that rely very heavily on executive function, even in the developing brain, and this is a really tricky one. We understand that our brains don't fully develop until our mid-20s. If you give a 13 or 12-year-old a game that's very heavily oriented to, inhibiting response, right? And you give them practice in that, again, executive function type of stuff, does that make them better at that particular task? And the answer is we don't know yet. Although we are taking an educated guess here that it can't hurt, and the likelihood is that it probably does. When we've started trying to collect some data on this, I was working along with another group, and we started with kids who actually had specific deficits in certain brain areas, and we were looking to see if the methodology could create, through repetition, could it create changes? And sadly, we had to end that study before we could complete it. Didn't quite get the numbers we were hoping for. But something to look forward to keep trying.
Yeah. Oh, so I appreciate those examples, John. And actually, related to your last point, given your history and research, were you planning on? There's going to be like a study with this work. I have like a very clear hypotheses, and I'm doing some sort of like test retest. It sounds like the initial component was you're running a business. So at the end of the day, if the kids say, "I hate this place and I don't want to come back," that's kind of data point one. You need to verify. But were there other kind of hypotheses came up?
Oh, there are lots of hypotheses that have come up because it's again, it's an iterative process. It's dynamic, but at the end of the day, you could have the best damn scientific product in the world, and if nobody wants it, it doesn't it doesn't do much good. So we do have to find some balance in there. I mean, and the part that does make it a little bit easier, and I just sort of alluded to this, is that neuropsychological assessments, the really good ones anyway, the ones that have very high reliability and validity numbers related to what it purports to test and in the brain specifically, these are not necessarily fun games. These are sort of gamified assessments to make it a little more interesting, and the person who's very attentive will tend to perform a little bit better on some of these tasks. The problem with a lot of the games is they are what we would call dirty assessments, right? That they're not really all 100% focused in that area like a neuropsychological test would be. So they do branch out into other areas. So we did have to come up with a sort of hierarchy of games that say which one best fits in this model. And in the instances where we have 2 or 3 that are sort of what we would rate as equivalent, we would then say, okay, then which one do we find the most fun, or would kids find the most fun? And that becomes our number one choice, our primary choice. And when I keep using the word we, what's ended up happening over time is I've invited my staff who are interested to work with me, and we've created what we call a curriculum task force. And we are going in and as a group evaluating all of the games, and more importantly, all of the new games that come out, because there's always new games coming out, and some better reflect things that we're trying to capture, and others less so. So we're always trying to keep it updated and fresh. And I suppose that's kind of like version 2 of some textbook somewhere. But
sure,
what it is.
The updated and revised, expanded edition. Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know if that answers the question.
Oh, sorry, John.
No, I was saying I just don't know if that answers the question.
I think you.
Okay.
In terms of so the hypotheses, I think so. In the iterative process of looking at the games and having new foci, I guess, depending on the number of games. Now, in terms of go ahead. Sorry,
I was going to add. Sorry, the really cool thing is, given the sheer volume of games out there, some of which are out of print, you just can't buy anymore, but they're great fits. We now have, I would say, 2 to 3 years worth of game material where kids are not going to repeat. And that's pretty cool because that keeps it fresh most of the time. And then it does repeat. And for kids who stay in our program and sort of progress through it, and believe it or not, we've now had kids in our program going on 7+ years. Never expected that.
Wow.
That's
amazing.
They come back 2 or 3 years later to the next level curriculum, and now they approach a game that they played already, and you can see tremendous differences in the way they approach a game. And just to give you an example of that, imagine, a game that's not in our curriculum, but one that I think makes for a good example is, think about the way a kid would play the game Battleship versus an adult, right? Kids, when playing Battleship, I'll just give you some characteristics of their style of play. And, if you have a kid, this should be really pretty obvious. There's a randomness to the numbers and letters that they call once they understand the grid system. There's often not tracking of what they've already called out. So not infrequently, they may repeat something they've already called out and then get upset when, of course, the other person said, you already said that. Nope, you don't get to go again. My turn. Right. And versus an adult who might take the approach to the game much more clinically and much less, say, fun, but probably a greater likelihood of winning, which is, okay, my smallest boat out there is a 2. So I'm just going to call out increments of 2 all the way across the board, and maybe I'll hit something. But right. And so there's a sort of a sequential attack in the game, or sequential approach to the problem solving that will probably, over multiple trials, have much better results than somebody who does random numbers and letters and, even repeat some of them.
Sure. That's actually, that's how I played Battleship the last time I played it. It was kind of boring.
True. But, so those are the types of things we see, right? We see that there are changes in approaches. And it's actually a very important part of our curriculum to articulate what those changes are. And key to our program is that it's not really coming from the staff. The staff are guiding the conversations, but we want it kid focused. And the reason we want, and this sort of ties into the whole learning thing, the reason we want it kid focused is if you look at all of the educational and learning literature, the model that I think shows the strongest impact is this sort of Soviet Luria model of learning, where you are teaching just a skosh above the cognitive strategy understanding that the kid has, and best if the kids are learning it directly from their peers. Right? So we try to make this a very child-centered experience where the staff are facilitating the kids articulating what moves they're making, showing good sportsmanship, et cetera, et cetera. But really trying to get the kids to articulate and speak up about moves, being able to say, I don't understand why you did that. Right? Help me understand why you think that's a good move. So they're becoming now thoughtful motions versus random motions in a game.
So, John, when you talk about that level of kind of, verbalizing the processes, is that sort of a component of the overall, way to teach the games? Because it sounds like you're going farther beyond, okay, everyone, I'm going to read you the instructions real quick and then have at it. I'll be, drinking a coffee over here. Like it's a more directed process with a lot of modeling to start. Am I kind of?
Yeah, you sort of tapped into a big part of the way we've modeled our programs, which is we play every game we do for 2 weeks, and we have primary, secondary, and tertiary games as aligned by brain function, with the primary being the best fit. Week one, always starts with assuming the group has already met and had their rapport sessions and feeling comfortable. And here's a key to it is, and I can't emphasize this enough, feeling okay to make mistakes, because ultimately we do learn really well from making mistakes. Once that's sort of been established, when we enter a new game, it will often start by getting the kids to articulate what the table rules are, just as a framework for what's the expectation of behavior and our approach. As the staff person sort of goes through the rules, they're encouraging the kids to see if they can identify similarities to other games that they've already played, because again, the games sort of go sequentially. And what we're ultimately hoping to hear is, oh, this is just like so-and-so game, right? So if we played a game called, I was just teaching this one today, if we play a game called Mind Shift, it would be really great to hear a kid say, oh, this plays a lot like Quarto or Pentago or even Chinese checkers, right? And so if you can get the kids to sort of make those associations, learning is taking place because they have very similar properties and structures in the games. And then after we go through the rules, we don't even start playing yet. The kids are chomping at the bit to play, but we will say to them, okay, given what we know, what we think we know, how do you think, what's the best strategy to go about winning this game? So week one for us is a lot about fits and starts. It's about stopping games at various points and helping the kids articulate who made a great move, who do we think is winning at the moment, because that's always a good one, because especially when you have every kid at the table raise their hand and say they're winning. So not and it's a zero-sum game. This really leads to good information. And usually, not all the time though, we will complete a game in the first week. Completing the game is actually less important to us, other than when we do complete the game, we do then want to have a period of just reflection with the kids, where we say, at what point do we think the winning move was made by so-and-so, right? And having the kids begin to analyze the process of what happened. And, we try to reward them by, acknowledging mistakes. So, part of our program is during the middle of the class, we'll give out, a snack or something like that. And we'll often say to the person at the table, whoever can tell me where they think they made a critical mistake will get the first choice of the bag of chips or whatever it is, right? Something, again, we're trying to get the kids to think at that level and motivate them to do so. Week 2 is then a review of the rules and sort of the top-down methods of solving the problem, but then it's trial and error. That's when the staff person sits back a little more and says, all right, we know what we think are the main strategies in this game. Maybe there's some others we haven't considered yet. Have at it. Let's really have some fun. So week 2 is much more about now kids with a much more fully informed approach to the game, then trying it out and seeing what worked and what didn't. Again, trying to really impress upon the kids that sometimes taking chances may work, it may not work, and it's okay if it doesn't work. That's kind of the key there.
Sure. And John, do you notice that they do continue to model that language that maybe the staff used in terms of like, I think I made this move, I'm not sure if it was the right one, or at least, when they're getting a check-in from the staff members, they're either better able to, or are they spontaneously still kind of engaging in that level of verbal problem solving, perhaps?
Sometimes, yes. It's largely age dependent. Obviously, as the kids get older, they have an easier time articulating it. At the younger ages, and when I say younger ages, anywhere between 5 and 10, it's a process of learning, right? A lot of kids are very set on winning, and we have to sort of back off from that a little bit. Sometimes we might even try a cooperative game to get started, just so that it's oh no, this isn't you just running away with the board. We all have to work together to win, or we all lose. And that sometimes helps set us in the right direction.
Sure. Yeah. So I know you mentioned a little bit at the, when we started talking a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons, and I know it was mentioned at the kind of the tail end of the It's All a Game book that was something that the store was starting to explore as the after school programs. With Dungeons and Dragons being just this like hot, like you said, it's the hot, sexy property these days. Even years ago, I was always surprised we didn't see more programs using Dungeons and Dragons, because it feels very made. If you had a really good DM or GM, like really tailor made for cooperative language, for problem solving, for social skill development in a safe, controlled environment. Am I just sort of like spouting buzzwords that the Wizards of the Coast would love to put on the box? Or are you seeing the same? Are you seeing that that's actually maybe coming true in some of the groups that you run?
Yeah, the answer is yes to all of the above, right? And in fact, I would take it a step further. So just I'll sort of step back one bit and say, when we first started our programming, we did not include Dungeons and Dragons. And the reason there was no Dungeons and Dragons was I could not, for the life of me, figure out where in the brain Dungeons and Dragons resided. If you want to talk about clean to dirty, this was about as dirty as it got, right? There were so many different elements. I just couldn't identify it as one specific area. And so it wasn't part of the program. And I was there playing games with kids who all, by the way, came from a program of kids with sort of neurodevelopmental learning disabilities. And they looked at me and were playing through a game, and they were having a great time. And they said, have you ever heard of this game called Dungeons and Dragons? We hear it's kind of fun. And I'm like, yeah, I know Dungeons and Dragons pretty well. Actually, I didn't really. I only knew the original AD&D. I had no idea there was more than the original version of it at the time. And I was like, yeah, sadly, it's not part of the program. And so they accepted that, and we finished what we were doing. And the next week we came back, and it was the repeat week. And as if we'd never had the conversation before, the same kid asked me, have you ever heard of this game, Dungeons and Dragons? We hear it's really fun. And I said to myself, okay, before getting into business, a little bit of the research I did, one of the things I learned was the customer is always right. And so I thought to myself, okay, we're coming into some free play for the final weeks of the program where the kids can choose whatever they want. Maybe I can run home to my parents' attic, dig out all my old books and dice from a box somewhere, which is what I did, and give them an introduction to the game just because they were great kids, and why not? And they all agreed to do it. And lo and behold, I just gave them sort of a quick dungeon crawl. They were hooked. They were hooked instantly. And I hadn't really paid too much mind to it other than let's just have fun. And they had so much fun. In fact, the next week, they invited a whole bunch of friends to come with them. And then after that, we were sort of going into the new term. They begged me to keep it going, and they had more friends coming. And the next thing I know, I had to hire another staff person just to keep that table, to get another table of kids running. So, it was at some point in there, I said to myself, I'd be really kind of foolish not to include Dungeons and Dragons as part of the program. This is back in like 2010, 2011. Maybe I really ought to dig in and figure out what it is that's going on in the brain so I can feel comfortable including it in the program. And so I did. And sadly, the data isn't great, but what I have been able to glean from it is that really what we're dealing with is called theory of mind, right? The ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, the ability to show empathy, right? The ability to either visualize a map or have it placed in front of you. So there's a whole thing of perceptual organization and spatial orientation. There's the idea of leveling up, which is one of the most incredible reward systems. Right. And then there's this idea of the fantasy-based hero that kids get to play, right? So, maybe they're not the most athletic kids, but now they are a great warrior, right? Or maybe they struggle in school with academics, but now they're great wizards, right? So all of these things really had tremendous benefits, I thought. Whether we could demonstrate where in the brain it was or wasn't, I think we've gotten pretty good about where we think it is, and it's pretty much all over the place. And to lo and behold, today, it is by far our largest program. I'm running, amongst the different stores, I'm running 5 to 8 games a day.
Wow.
Of 6 kids each, at various levels, and of different age ranges. And we've learned a lot. It's incredible. And we've learned a lot along the way. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So you mentioned that, some of the groups, or at least that initial group, you had a lot of, learners who either had, learning disabilities or various learning disabilities. Is that something that you've kind of seen either anecdotally, or whether it's sort of a part of the, process of, asking parents, or are there things we should know about your child to make sure that their experience is positive? Have you seen a growth in terms of just the diversity, like the neurodiversity of children who are interested in joining the program? Has that, kind of just varied year by year? Oh, great. What sorts of groups?
Well, specifically, I'll give you an interesting, just an aside, and then I'll get into it. That very first group I was talking about, I'm walking down the street one morning. I run into a parent whose kid was coming to the school, and she looked at me and she says, "What did you do to them?" And I got really panicked. I was like, "Holy crap, what did he tell you?"
Call the government about this one.
Yeah, I was like, and she said, he's badly dyslexic, and he stayed up all night writing a story about the adventure they had. And I was like, whoa, that's incredible. Wow. And she wanted to know what I was doing that got him so motivated. And I had to say to her, other than giving him the world to step into, that's all him, right? So I think what's happening for parents, and as we see growth in neurodivergence playing this game, is that parents are having really, really great experiences with their kids who may not be able to write or read so well, as an example, but are willing to make the effort because it's so engaging and so fun and so rewarding, right? And if their peers are doing it, and they can laugh about it, and they can get upset about it, and they can get deeply ingrained with their imagery and imagination, boy, oh boy, you've hit gold, right? Because, and I'll give you sort of an interesting, sort of hiccup we learned over the years. So fast forward today, we do a lot of groups that have 2E kids with varying levels of success. Some are all twice exceptional kids who are what we used to call Asperger's kids, right? They're now called 2E, where they're sort of off the charts in one area academically and not even on the charts in another area, and it's usually social skills kind of thing. We had one kid in one of our groups, and he was the sweetest kid, 2E, and he was playing with a group of kids who were not 2E. And I got called in at this point because there was a lot of conflict in the group, and specifically that all the non-2E kids wanted to kick the 2E kid out of the game. They were trying to kill him in the game, and the DM was going, how do I handle this? What's going on here? So I sat in and I watched what was happening. Clearly, from day one, this kid who was diagnosed 2E had been told, and he had internalized it very well, never, ever react with violence. We use our words. So every time they encountered a monster, he wanted to talk to it. So all these other kids, they just wanted to fight and kill and be murder hobos and whatever.
I got this giant axe for a reason. Come on. Yeah.
And so, there was some conflict in the game around that. And, I worked with the DM to try to get the kids working together as a group. And I believe we had some pretty good success with that, where the kids were ultimately, by including this other kid in the group as part of the accepted group with everybody else, the whole group got better rewards, right? They found more magic, better treasure, whatever it was. That just kind of made everybody happier and ultimately led to a very positive experience.
Okay. So you weighted the reward system based on actions a little bit within the context of the game.
That's one of our strategies. So, one of the things you'll see, running games with kids specifically, is very often you'll have half a group very engaged and half a group totally distracted, whatever reason. There's a lot of really, simple things we can do related to behavioral reinforcement that can get everybody's attention very focused, which is you can focus on the kids who are all paying attention and just say, hey, a pile of treasure, you just stumbled upon it. And I bet you dollars to donuts, those other kids who weren't paying attention want part of that treasure. And oh no, sorry, that these guys were over here, they were paying attention, they saw it. You want to bet those other kids are going to start paying more attention? As long as you reward them for paying attention later on, you can get everybody back. There's other ways we have.
I love that. Contingencies within the Dungeons and Dragons game itself. Which, of course, that makes perfect sense, right? It's you're making it up as you go. You can put the contingencies in.
In some instances, yes, these are called homebrews, right? Where people sort of make up their own worlds, and you can't meta the game, meaning you can't have studied the player's handbook and the monster manual and know everything that's coming, which we've seen a lot of kids do, and adults for that matter, versus games that are already prescribed, where there's an adventure and, if a dungeon master is trying to be creative and describe, what the creature looks like without saying it, you might have a player be like, "Oh, that's an orc. I know what that is. It has an armor class of 4." And and so it's fun dynamics.
Sure. So, John, what is it you think it is about playing games that people just kind of glom onto? It just has this positive effect. I mean, I'm talking about other people that you're reporting on playing games, and I'm having a great time just, in the conversation. Like, what is it? Do you have a hypothesis or theory about, board games are great because, and, whether there's data or not to support the claim?
Look, board games are great for a lot of reasons, and I don't think there's any one particular factor. I think the first one is it's a social occasion. And boy, oh boy, if you want to talk about an esoteric punch in the gut, COVID, for our type of business. And we tried to do it online and we had some varying success. But, once protocols have been put in place and we can have people coming back and being face to face, man, oh man, everybody, kids and adults, are craving this. We are social beings. So I think for starters, the nature of social interaction and who we are as a species neatly align, right? Games have been around forever. early on, if you go way back into sort of like Greek and Greek literature, some games, especially anyone that involved dice rolling, was considered vice, and was you were less of a character for for doing those sort of behaviors. So there's always been a social demand on the way games play. But that, other than the social interaction, then there is the reward, and this is a huge reward, of being the victor, right? If you're playing a zero-sum game and you figured it out, you've outsmarted your opponent, right? There is great reward in that. Or when you work as a group, there's great reward in all of you reaping some kind of benefit or reward or leveling up. And then here's sort of another interesting thing. Games have evolved tremendously over the past 20, 25 years. So compared to games when I was a kid, and I mentioned this earlier, we called sort of Ameritrash games. What these games really were dominant strategy games. Most of the games in America at the time were dominant strategy, meaning there was really only one strategy that won the game pretty much every time, and it was often just a matter of luck, whether you get it or not. And so for somebody who has a fairly sophisticated understanding of what's interesting and not, that became fairly uninteresting fairly quickly. And it's often why a lot of games sort of sat in the closet for a long time. And when people did play them, it was for nostalgic reasons, right? In 1995, we saw Klaus Tuber's Settlers of Catan come out. First time we saw a game that didn't have a finite board, or a board game that wasn't finite, that the board itself could be varied every play. We'll leave Dungeons and Dragons aside because that was late 70s. But as far as board games go, and then we were introduced to the worker placement strategy games, right? Where there was no dominant strategy, that the game was dynamic because based on what the person to your left or right did or across the table from you, the way you won was going to change. And so it was never the same game. And since then, I mean, the evolution of the games has been remarkable.
It's so true. I mean, I'm always shocked how many different games there are and how they can just keep coming out with new games. Weekly there's 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, you have to stock the shelves, so you probably see that firsthand. Just how many games there are, how many types there are. Which I guess in terms of popularity, if you've got that much variation, there's something for everybody, right? Or there should be, at least.
There should be. You would like to think so. It really depends on the people at the table. I remember early on at the Strategist, I had a group of adults come in and they all wanted to play Risk. It was a mix of adult men and women, and guys were all super psyched. The women less so. I did my best to try to describe it in the way I knew how. And I was really kind of surprised how quickly eyes glazed over when I started trying to explain how the dice rolling worked. And I was like, this may not be the best choice for this group. And then I tried recommending something that was a little more accessible to other people. Ultimately, I think they tried Risk. It didn't go so well. And then they tried something else.
Yeah. So, John, I know we're almost out of time. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, so I mean, it's been so exciting to hear about the program, but as kind of an expert, you're living the field every day of board games. I kind of wanted you to switch and just talk generally about some some favorites. So you don't have to do top 3. You can do top 1 if you have one. But I know sometimes I'll ask people a top 1, and they're like, I can't do. They get upset. I don't want anyone to be anxious when they're talking to me. So
that's like asking me who my favorite child is. I get it.
So top 1, 2, 3, however many, would you recommend for people who are listening who have families and they're like, board games are supposed to be pretty good. So what would be like 1 to 3 games you'd recommend for kind of a family to play together?
Sure. Again, I would still have some questions about the ages of the family, but we'll assume a mix of anywhere from kids to teenagers.
Yes.
One of the very favorite games that I've had over the past 10 years, is a game called Deceit, which is spelled Dixit, Dixit. Right. And it is an absolutely brilliant game. It's a game where you get a handful of these very trippy but beautifully designed cards. And everybody, it sort of follows the apples to apples model where everybody takes a turn giving a clue. You choose a card from your hand and you have to give a clue about it. And then everybody puts one card down in the center and they get shuffled, flipped over, and then everybody votes for who gave the clue card. Here's the catch in the game, and this is the mechanic that makes it really cool. If the if everybody guesses it right, the clue giver doesn't get any points. So in an ideal universe, the clue giver gives an abstract enough clue that everybody but one person gets it. That's the best score you can get. But if you put a card down that's similar to the clue and somebody votes for your card, you get points, that kind of thing. So I think it's a really brilliant game. It's very family friendly. You just have to be mindful of the ages of the kids because younger kids will tend to give very concrete answers. And it's a great exercise in trying to teach levels of abstraction.
Sure. That makes sense. Now,
go ahead.
So did you have any others you want to do for families, or I don't know how you are on time.
I would share the game my family plays the most is a card game called Tichu. And it's a 4-player partner-based trick-taking game. I believe it's a Korean game, and it has been around for a little while. And it's sort of a great hybrid of bridge meets poker meets Uno. If that's appealing. So I absolutely, we love that game, and my oldest daughter and myself are hoping one day to go to Europe and sit in on some of the tournaments they have there because there's not a ton of interest in this country for that game. And then I would simply throw in there, there's the game I play the most. I still play every day online, and I am in a face-to-face league, and I am old like a dinosaur when I say this. And sadly, the people who play this game are old and dinosaurs like me, and it's maybe someday is going to fade out, is Stratimatic Baseball. Because I am a baseball fan, I am a huge statistical fan, or statistics fan, and it just gives me great pleasure playing that. I know I have argued with many of my staff at length about whether this is actually a game or not versus a simulation.
There's a game component to it, right? Though you have to use the stats and everything, don't you?
Yes, exactly.
And just kind of my last just query, and this is personal. And this isn't for my listeners. This is just for me. We have 2 co-hosts. They're not here today, but one is my wife, who plays games with me pretty regularly. Unless it's a game where you can screw another player. She hates those games. It's the only time I've ever seen her get angry at anyone other than me. And we have another co-host who says she hates games. She doesn't want to play games. She doesn't want to do games. She will for a birthday. What's the board game to get that person that we all know that we want to have them join our game night, but they're kind of a board game hater overall? Is there a magic game that you found just sucks people in?
Yeah, there's a few of them. Sometimes you might not even think they're games because they're just sort of more like silly behavioral things you can do as a group. But just really basic games like even something like Telestrations, right, is something that most people get. You don't have to really go over the rules too much, and I think that's part of it. I think where if the rules are readily understandable and it's based on some kind of intuitive skill that most people have, it's pretty good. I'm trying to think of what was the other game we played. I'll give you an example. I'll do a shout out for some of my former neighbors, local game inventors. They invented a game, and there's many like it, called Schmovie. And this is a game, again, based on an apples to apples model, where you roll a dice to figure out a genre. You pick out a who and a why card, and you basically everyone has to come. Somebody takes the turn being a judge, and everybody has to come up with a movie title, right? So this is something that, and some of the answers are really funny, and so something that's easy to engage, has a little bit of challenge, right, and is something that most people feel they can get without having to know a bazillion rules, is probably the easiest way in. And there's actually quite a few games like that. And these are called party or parlor games. And if you go to any of your friendly local neighborhood game stores, they should have a pretty clear section for those type of games, and just ask about them. And there's a lot of great choices.
Excellent. Well, Dr. John Freeman, it was such a pleasure having you on, talking about your programs, learning, the brain, and just games in general. It was a real blast. If folks out there, I don't know how much traveling everyone's doing these days. I know it's a little bit different, but if they find themselves in the kind of the Metro New York area, where can they check out? I mean, I guess Brooklyn for the Brooklyn Strategist.
The Brooklyn Strategist is located in Carroll Gardens, right? Just an easy walk from downtown Brooklyn. And Hex & Company is located, we have one on the Upper West Side by Columbia University, and one on the Upper East Side at 76th and First Avenue. Great food, great drink, great companionship, and a lot of fun.
Once again, big thanks to Dr. John Freeman for coming on the show, for talking with us about his programs. I know I am very excited to get out and start traveling again. Love to make my way back to New York with the family. Just a really fun place to visit. And I think I'll have to make Brooklyn a stop so that I can check out the Brooklyn Strategist and maybe see if John's there to play some of those board games. Thank you all very much for listening to this bonus episode. I hope that you found a topic a little bit different than our norm, was kind of a fun extra for the feed. We really appreciate you listening to ABA Inside Track. If you liked this topic and say, I'd love to have this, but plus research, well, don't worry. We'll be back with our regularly scheduled episodes in the new weeks. We also have a number of other episodes that you can find that get a little bit more off topic in our Patreon feed, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where we'd love to have you come there and join us for some of those extras. If you're just finding us for the first time, stay tuned, subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can get even more episodes, the bonuses, but plus some of our regularly scheduled episodes. They'll be coming back at you. Don't worry. This is an extra one as well. So with that all out of the way, thanks very much for listening. Thanks again to Dr. John Freeman. We'll be back whenever. It's a bonus, so I don't know if we're going to have another episode coming out this week or next week, but there'll be another episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.